Hey, tax fighters, this is Gage Hobrick holding down the fort for the Taxpayer Army out in Saskatchewan. I decided today to bring on my colleague Carson Binda from British Columbia to talk about how he got the BC carbon tax scrapped. We talk a lot about the federal consumer carbon tax, and the BC story is a little bit overshadowed. And as a guy who comes from a province that has always had governments that have stood against the carbon tax, it's really interesting to see the huge turnaround in BC and trying to figure out how taxpayers won that fight and how that pertains to the future. So, Carson, thanks for joining me. And if you could give a little quick spiel about how exactly the BC carbon tax works for people who didn't know and your role in that fight.
Yeah, absolutely, Gage. Well, thank you so much for having me on. It's always great to chat with you. So, BC had not just Canada, but North America's oldest carbon tax. Way back in 2008, the then BC Liberal government, led by a guy named Gordon Campbell, brought in North America's first consumer carbon tax. But at the time it was brought in, it was revenue neutral. That means for every dollar of revenue the carbon tax stole from British Columbians, there were tax cuts that corresponded with that revenue. So in British Columbia specifically, we saw income taxes going down as a result of this revenue neutral consumer carbon tax. But Gage, there's a problem with politicians. They like to tell fibs. And that's exactly what we saw in British Columbia. Before too long, the BC government, by this point, it was led by a woman named Christy Clark, whose name has been in the news a few times lately. Christy Clark's government started bundling all of these pre-existing tax credits into the formula they used to argue that the carbon tax was revenue neutral. So we'd had film tax credits on the books in BC since the 90s, but suddenly around 2014, 2013, Christy Clark started claiming that those tax credits were offsetting the carbon tax. So it was nonsense, right? British Columbians saw right through that. At the time, people were calling it a big accounting exercise. The carbon tax wasn't revenue neutral after that point. It was taking a lot more money from British Columbians than it was returning through tax cuts. And by the time the NDP got in power, they stopped pretending it was revenue neutral altogether. And by that point, it was costing British Columbians a whole lot of money. So that's sort of in very broad strokes, a history of the consumer carbon tax here in beautiful BC.
Okay, that all makes sense. But I remember we both started at the CTF around the same time. I remember we were talking kind of when we both started, like, so Carson, what's one of your goals? I remember you telling me that you wanted to crush the BC carbon tax because of how much it was costing British Columbia families. And, as a fellow tax fighter myself, I wished you the best of luck, but I knew that was going to be a big hill to climb. And it seems that so did some of the reporters when you first got on the job. You told me a really funny story about that on your first press conference about the carbon tax.
That's right, Gage. Yeah, my very first press conference as BC director for the CTF, I went down to Victoria, where our provincial capital is, called up all the journalists and told them we were going to be fighting the carbon tax. So we had the cameras out, we had journalists out, microphones in my face. And I told the press that we were calling on then Premier John Horgan to immediately cancel the carbon tax. Now, it's worth noting that when John Horgan was in opposition, when the Liberals were in power and the NDP were in opposition, John Horgan would rail against the carbon tax all the time. He said folks wouldn't be able to afford to heat their homes when the wild West Coast winds were howling, and he was right. But then as premier, he kept jacking it up. So I held a press conference calling on John Horgan to end the consumer carbon tax in BC. And a journalist, from the CBC said, Carson, aren't you wasting my time and the premier's time by even calling on him to cancel the carbon tax? Since he's been premier, he's been its biggest cheerleader. Even the opposition, the BC Liberals, were in favor of the carbon tax. So across the political spectrum in BC, everyone was supporting the carbon tax. Everyone except the people who were paying the bills, Gage. And that's where the cracks started to emerge in the government's argument.
Right, and that's exactly right, because the politicians are out there making their six-figure salaries with their big expense accounts, as we both know, all across the country. They're not the actual people who are filling up their cars every day to work and getting hit with that carbon tax. So I think that's a really important point. So going forward, when we talked about your fight to the carbon tax, I think one of the most important things that you highlighted, along with the taxpayer army, is talking about how the BC carbon tax didn't work. The government said they were supposed to reduce emissions by a certain level, but you proved and you stood out in front of, I think, the legislative building again and put out the numbers and showed that it didn't work. And that was a really big turning point as well.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I actually think the turning point came a little bit sooner than that. It came when we finally got the then official opposition, which had gone through a rebrand. They were called BC United now, not the soccer team, the political party. Um, Through writing op-eds, through getting our taxpayer army involved by sending emails and calling politicians, we were able to force the official opposition, the guys who brought in the carbon tax in the first place way back in 2008, to say, hold on, this policy isn't working. It's leaving people far worse off, and it's not revenue neutral. And for the folks in the rest of the country, we also weren't getting those rebates. The rebates in British Columbia only went to a really, really small cohort of the absolute lowest income earners, not to normal families. So getting the official opposition to finally say we don't support the carbon tax, I think that was a huge turning point. But the real big turning point, Gage, came when the government released its emissions data. Now, that was really important because we were able to use the government's own numbers to show that the carbon tax wasn't reducing emissions like they promised it would. Because when BC's carbon tax was brought in, the government actually passed a law, the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Act, which mandated that because of the carbon tax, emissions would go down by 33% between 2007 and 2020. Do you want to guess if that happened, Gager?
Well, I think I know the answer to that question, but I'll let you fill everybody else in.
Yeah, of course it didn't happen. Taxing Canadians, taxing British Columbians for heating our homes or driving to work, it's not going to meaningfully reduce emissions. And that's what we saw in British Columbia. And in fact, today, emissions are higher than before we brought in the carbon tax. So I went to Premier David Eby's constituency office here in Vancouver with two jerry cans. One of them said emissions up, the other one said carbon tax up. And we held a great press conference and really spread that message about how the carbon tax was not working.